3 days. That's all Sarah Chen had before she and her 7-year-old daughter would be living in their car. The eviction notice felt like ice against her trembling fingers, the red stamp bleeding across the white paper like a wound that wouldn't heal. With only $347 in her checking account and nowhere to go, Sarah faced an impossible choice: accept defeat and beg her cruel ex-husband for help, or gamble everything on one desperate chance that could either save them or destroy them completely. "Mama, why are you crying?" Emma's voice cut through the suffocating silence, her small frame appearing in the doorway, clutching the worn stuffed elephant that had survived every move, every sleepless night, every broken promise that things would get better. The elephant's button eyes seemed to hold more hope than Sarah felt in her entire body. Sarah quickly folded the notice, forcing her lips into something resembling a smile. "I'm not crying, sweetheart. Mama's just thinking really hard about our next adventure." The lie tasted bitter, but Emma's world had already been shattered enough when her father walked out 18 months ago, taking his engineering salary and leaving behind only court papers demanding shared custody he never intended to exercise. "Is it like the adventure stories you tell me?" Emma climbed onto the couch, her tiny hands reaching for Sarah's face with the earnestness only children possess. "The ones where the princess has to be really brave before she finds her castle?" The metaphor hit too close to home. Sarah had been telling herself the same story for months, that this was temporary, that her freelance graphic design work would pick up, that the child support checks would eventually arrive, that somehow she'd find their castle. But castles cost more than the $347 remaining in her checking account. "Something like that, baby." Sarah pulled Emma close, breathing in the strawberry scent of her daughter's shampoo, the expensive kind she'd splurged on last week, because some things, some small dignities, were worth borrowing against tomorrow's problems. Sometimes princesses have to be really creative about finding their castles. If you're enjoying Sarah and Emma's journey so far, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of families who refuse to give up on their dreams. The laptop chimed from the kitchen table, a sound that usually meant work, but more often delivered disappointment. Another client is pushing payment to next quarter, another freelance platform rejecting her proposal, another digital dead end in the maze of modern survival. But this time, as Sarah scrolled through her email with Emma warm against her side, something caught her eye. "Urgent estate liquidation, county auction tomorrow," screamed the subject line from a local government address she'd signed up for months ago in a moment of desperate optimism. Her finger hovered over the delete button. She'd learned to avoid temptation when her wallet couldn't afford her dreams. But something in the preview text made her pause. Various properties including residential, commercial, and rural holdings. Minimum bids starting at $100. All sales final, cash or certified funds only. Rural holdings. The words sparked something she'd buried deep beneath layers of practical worry. Sarah had grown up on her grandmother's small farm in Montana, before college, before the city, before everything became about networking and digital portfolios and proving her worth through Wi-Fi connections. She remembered the way morning light looked different when it hit open land, how silence could be a comfort instead of a threat, how the earth itself seemed to promise that tomorrow could be different from today. "Emma, how would you feel about living somewhere with lots of space to run around? Maybe even some animals? Like horses, and maybe a dog, and chickens that give us eggs for breakfast?" "Maybe, sweetheart, just maybe." Sarah was already pulling up the auction details, her heart hammering against her ribs. The listing was sparse, clinical in its legal language, but one entry made her breath catch. Parcel 47B, 180-acre ranch property, structures in disrepair, no utilities, minimal road access. Minimum bid, $300. $300. The exact amount sitting in her emergency fund, the money she'd sworn to keep untouched for Emma's sake, for medical emergencies or absolute worst-case scenarios. But what was more worst case than homelessness? What was more emergency than running out of options?
Sarah spent the rest of that night researching Parcel 47B with the focused intensity of someone betting everything on a single roll of the dice. The property sat 40 miles outside of Cedar Falls, a town barely large enough for a post office and a gas station. Satellite images showed a cluster of weathered buildings surrounded by rolling hills that stretched toward mountains purple with distance. No recent sales in the area, no development plans, no apparent reason anyone would want this particular patch of forgotten America. Perfect for someone who needed to disappear from debt collectors and disappointed clients and the steady drumbeat of failure that had become her life's soundtrack. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, autumn's warning that winter wouldn't wait for anyone to get their life together. Sarah had exactly enough gas to make the drive to the county courthouse and enough cash to bid once. If she won, they'd have a home. If she lost, they'd have neither home nor money nor much time to figure out alternative solutions. "This is exciting, Mama!" Emma bounced in her car seat as they pulled into the courthouse parking lot, her enthusiasm untempered by understanding what they were risking. "Are we really going to buy a ranch like on TV?" "We're going to try, sweetheart, but remember what we talked about. Sometimes trying is all we can do." The auction room smelled like old coffee and desperate hope, filled with faces Sarah recognized from the unemployment office and the food bank. People like her, balanced on the edge of falling, looking for solid ground anywhere they could find it. The auctioneer's voice carried the rhythm of someone who'd watched dreams bought and sold for decades, quick and efficient, and strangely compassionate in its briskness. Property after property sold for amounts that Sarah stoic clench. A tiny duplex went for $8,000, a commercial lot for $15,000. Even the properties marked as is and buyer beware commanded prices that belonged to other people's universes. "Parcel 47B, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying no special emphasis. 180 acres, existing structures, no warranties, no guarantees. Buyer assumes all liabilities and responsibilities. Do I hear 300? Sarah's hand trembled as she raised it, feeling every eye in the room turn toward her and Emma. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not mockery exactly, but recognition of someone making a move born of necessity rather than strategy. 300, I have 300, do I hear 350? Silence. The kind of silence that stretches time into elastic moments where entire futures hang in the balance. Going once at 300. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling Emma's small hand slipped into hers. Going twice. Please, she found herself praying to whoever might be listening, please let this be the right kind of crazy. Sold to bidder number 47 for $300. The gavel's bang echoed like a gunshot, final and irreversible. Sarah had just bought 180 acres of Montana uncertainty with the last of their safety net, and she had no idea whether she'd just saved their lives or destroyed them completely. We're halfway through Sarah's incredible story, and if you're wondering what happens next, make sure to hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the craziest risks lead to the most amazing rewards. The paperwork felt surreal, her signature binding them to a place she'd never seen, to a life she couldn't imagine. The clerk's congratulations sounded hollow, professional courtesy masking what they all knew. This was either the best decision she'd ever made or the worst, with no middle ground for comfort. As they walked out into the courthouse parking lot, Sarah's phone buzzed. Marcus, her ex-husband, calling with what she knew would be his monthly check-in to confirm she was still failing at life without him. Hello, Marcus? Sarah, I need to adjust the pickup schedule for Emma this weekend. Diane and I are going to Aspen, and... Actually, Marcus, there's been a change. Emma and I are moving. A pause that felt loaded with all their shared history of his disappointment in her choices. Moving? Where? You can't just relocate with my daughter without proper legal... To our ranch. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear traffic in the background of his expensive downtown office. I'm sorry, did you just say ranch? Sarah, what the hell have you done now? Emma looked up at her with curious eyes, and Sarah realized this was one of those moments that would shape how her daughter understood the world. Would she learn that dreams were dangerous, that reaching beyond your circumstances was foolish? Or would she learn that sometimes, when you're already at the bottom, the only direction worth going is up. I bought us a ranch, Marcus. 180 acres in Cedar Falls. We're going to raise horses and have chickens and grow our own food. His laughter was sharp, cutting. The same laugh he'd used when she'd suggested starting her own design business, when she dreamed of writing children's books, when she'd still believed in possibilities that didn't fit his spreadsheets. A ranch? You? Sarah, you can barely keep your apartment, and now you think you're going to be some kind of farmer? How much debt did you take on for this fantasy? $300. Another silence. Longer this time. 300? What did you buy? A parking space? Sarah, this is exactly the kind of impulsive, irresponsible... It's done, Marcus. Sarah surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. Emma and I are starting a new life, and you can either be part of supporting that, or you can keep talking about what I can't do. But we're done apologizing for trying. She hung up before he could respond, her heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to pride. Mama, was Daddy being mean again? Emma's voice was small, careful, the tone of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions for survival. Daddy's just worried because he doesn't understand our kind of adventures yet, Sarah said, lifting Emma into her arms. But that's okay. Sometimes the best adventures are the ones that scare other people. As they drove away from the courthouse, the deed to parcel 47B sitting on the dashboard like a promise or a threat, Sarah felt the weight of what she'd just done settling into her bones. She'd gambled everything on a place she'd never seen, betting their future on satellite images and determination. But for the first time in months, she was driving towards something instead of away from it. For the first time since Marcus had walked out, she had made a choice instead of just reacting to choices made for her. It might be the wrong choice. It might be financial suicide. It might be the kind of mistake that people told cautionary tales about, but it was hers. And sometimes, when you're drowning, any hand that reaches down looks like salvation, even if it's your own. The gravel road to parcel 47B wound through dying grass and scrub brush like a scar across the landscape, each pothole jarring Sarah's already fragile confidence. Her Honda Civic, never meant for rural adventures, protested with every bump and dip, the muffler scraping against rocks that jutted up like accusations. Emma had fallen asleep against the window, her breath fogging the glass while her stuffed elephant stood guard in her small arms. When the ranch finally came into view, Sarah's heart sank so fast she thought she might be sick. The satellite images had been generous. What looked like weathered but standing structures from space revealed themselves as monuments to neglect and time's ruthless passage. The main house leaned heavily to one side, its porch sagging like a broken promise. Half the roof was missing, exposing rafters that reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Windows stared back at them, empty sockets in a face that had forgotten how to welcome anyone home. "Mama?" Emma stirred as the car came to a stop, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Is this our castle?" Sarah's throat closed around the words she needed to say. This wasn't a castle. This was barely shelter. This was the physical manifestation of every cruel joke Marcus had ever made about her judgment, every sneer from her mother about Sarah's unrealistic expectations, every whispered conversation she'd overheard at the unemployment office about people who made desperate choices and paid desperate prices. "It's going to be our castle, sweetheart," Sarah managed, the lies scraping against her vocal cords. "But first, we have to help it remember how to be beautiful." They sat in the car for 10 minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, while Sarah tried to summon courage from somewhere deeper than fear. The silence outside was total. No traffic, no neighbors, no safety net of civilization just a phone call away. The nearest town was 40 miles of winding mountain road, and even that was just a gas station and a post office that probably closed at 5. What had she done? "Can we explore now?" Emma's excitement was untainted by adult understanding of structural integrity and building codes. To her 7-year-old eyes, this was an adventure, a mystery, a place where anything could happen. Sarah forced herself to open the car door, cold November air rushing in to steal what warmth they'd gathered during the drive. The wind carried the smell of sage and something else, something old and forgotten, like the inside of a trunk that hadn't been opened in decades. The front porch groaned under their weight, boards bending in ways that suggested they were more hope than structure. The front door hung open, lock long since broken, revealing an interior that belonged in a horror movie rather than a home. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light that slanted through holes in the roof. The floorboards were warped and stained, and something that might have been wallpaper hung in strips like dead skin. "It smells funny," Emma whispered, staying close to Sarah's side. Old places always smell funny until they get cleaned up, though the smell was more than mustiness. It was decay, abandonment, the scent of dreams that had died slowly in empty rooms. They moved through the house like explorers in a tomb, cataloging the damage with each step. The kitchen sink had separated from the wall. The bathroom had no toilet, just a pipe sticking up from the floor like a periscope from some domestic submarine. Upstairs, where Emma hoped to find her bedroom, the ceiling had collapsed entirely, revealing a sky that promised snow before they'd found a way to keep warm. "Mama, where are we going to sleep tonight?" Emma's voice was smaller now, uncertainty creeping into her adventure story. Sarah had been asking herself the same question. The car would have to do, but nighttime temperatures were already dipping below freezing, and they had maybe a quarter tank of gas left to run the heater. She'd spent her last $300 on this place, leaving them with nothing for gas, food, or any of the 1,000 things she should have considered before making the most impulsive decision of her life. "It's going to be our castle, baby. We always do."
But as they walked back outside and Sarah surveyed their new kingdom, she wondered if optimism was just another word for delusion. The barn was missing one entire wall. The fence was down in so many places it looked like abstract art. What she'd hoped might be a working well was just a concrete ring around a hole so deep she couldn't see the bottom. No water, no electricity, no heat, no plan. Her phone had no signal, cutting them off from the world of Uber Eats and emergency services and the illusion that help was always just a call away. They were truly on their own. And Sarah was beginning to understand the difference between self-reliance and abandonment. "Look, Mama!" Emma's voice carried genuine delight from somewhere behind the barn. "There's a pretty lady!" Sarah's blood went cold. A pretty lady? Out here? She ran toward Emma's voice, images of kidnappers and worse flooding her mind, only to find her daughter crouched next to an old well, talking to something Sarah couldn't see. "Emma, get away from there right now!" "But Mama, she's nice. She says this used to be her home." Sarah reached Emma and pulled her back from the well's edge, heart hammering. There was no one there. No pretty lady, just the concrete ring and the darkness below, and Emma's 7-year-old imagination filling empty spaces with friendly ghosts. "Sweetheart, there's no one here. Sometimes when we're tired and everything is new, our minds play tricks on us." Emma looked genuinely confused. "But she told me her name is Anna, and she said there's treasure hidden somewhere on the ranch. She said the mean people who took her home never found it." A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the November wind. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in the power of place, in the way old sorrows could soak into wood and stone and wait for someone sensitive enough to hear their stories. "What else did this lady tell you?" "She said you're very brave and that Emma, that's me, is going to help you find what's hidden. She said the earth here wants to give gifts to people who love it." Sarah felt tears threatening and forced them back. Emma's imagination was just providing comfort where reality offered none, creating hope where circumstances suggested despair.
Children were remarkably gifted at survival, and maybe imaginary friends were just another adaptation to impossible situations. That's a very nice story, sweetheart. But right now we need to focus on real things, like where we're going to sleep and what we're going to eat. The sun was setting with the speed of late autumn, painting the mountains purple while stealing warmth from the air. Sarah made the decision that felt least dangerous. They'd sleep in the car, run the heater in shifts to conserve gas, and in the morning she'd drive back to town and figure out how to undo the mistakes she'd made. But as she opened the car door, she noticed something she'd missed earlier. Beside the broken porch, someone had once planted roses. The bushes were overgrown, wild, but still alive despite years of neglect. Hardy pink blooms defied the season, their petals thick with cold, but determined to bloom anyway. Someone had loved this place once. Someone had seen potential here, had planted beauty with their own hands and hoped it would last. "Mama, I'm hungry." Emma's voice cut through Sarah's philosophical moment. They had crackers in the car, some juice boxes, and half a jar of peanut butter, supplies meant for a day trip, not the beginning of a new life.
As they sat in the darkening car, sharing their meager dinner, Sarah felt the full weight of her decisions settling around them like the mountain cold. She'd taken her daughter away from their life, admittedly a failing life, but one with heat and running water and the infrastructure of civilization, and brought her to a place that offered nothing but space and silence and possibility that might be pure delusion. Marcus was right. She was irresponsible, impulsive, completely unprepared for the reality of owning land that required more than she could give. She was a graphic designer, not a pioneer. She knew Photoshop, not plumbing. She understood client management, not land management. What had she been thinking? "Mama, why are you sad again?" Emma had finished her crackers and was studying Sarah's face with the intensity children reserved for understanding the adults who controlled their world. "I'm not sad, baby. I'm just thinking about how much work we have to do to make this place into our home. But we can do it, right? We're good at fixing things." Were they? Sarah tried to remember when they'd successfully fixed anything more complicated than a broken toy or a torn book. Her apartment maintenance requests had always gone to building management. When her laptop crashed, she took it to the Geek Squad. When the car made strange noises, she prayed they'd stop making them because she couldn't afford a mechanic. But here, there was no management company, no Geek Squad, no safety net of people who got paid to solve problems she couldn't handle herself. Here, there was just her and Emma, and 180 acres of responsibility she bought for the price of a nice dinner in the city. "We'll learn," Sarah said, surprised to hear conviction in her own voice. "People lived on land like this for thousands of years without cell phones and grocery stores. We can figure it out too." They made it through the night in shifts, Sarah running the heater for 20 minutes every hour while Emma slept, then shutting it off and pulling her daughter close under their shared blanket while the car windows fogged with their breath. Outside, the silence was so complete it felt alive, broken only by sounds Sarah couldn't identify. Rustling that might be wind or animals, creaking that might be settling buildings or something moving in the darkness. Dawn came gray and brutal, frost covering the car windows like nature's judgment on their situation. Sarah's body ached from sleeping curled around the steering wheel, and Emma's face was pale with cold despite the blanket they had shared. "Good morning, adventurers," Sarah said with forced cheer as Emma stirred. "Ready for day 2 of ranch life?" Emma nodded solemnly, understanding somehow that their situation required bravery, even if she didn't fully grasp why. They ate the last of their crackers for breakfast, sharing one juice box between them, while Sarah tried to make a mental list of their most urgent needs: water, shelter, heat, food, money to pay for any of the above. The nearest neighbor, according to the property description, was 5 miles away. Sarah decided that would be their first stop. Maybe someone would know about the property's history, about whether the well could be fixed, about how people survived out here when the grid failed and civilization felt like a rumor. The walk to the neighbor's ranch was longer than 5 miles when measured in a 7-year-old steps. Emma started out chattering about the adventure, pointing out interesting rocks and asking questions about every bird and bush they passed. But after an hour, She was tired, cold, and asking when they could go home, which just questioned Sarah's chest because home was either behind them, in a place they could no longer afford, or ahead of them in a place that might be uninhabitable. The neighboring ranch looked like everything theirs wasn't. Neat fences, a well-maintained farmhouse, smoke rising from a chimney that suggested warmth and civilization and people who'd figured out how to make rural life work. Sarah almost turned back, embarrassed to approach strangers with needs written so clearly across her face. But Emma was shivering despite the walking, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The man who answered the door was perhaps 60, with hands that looked like they'd spent decades coaxing life from reluctant soil. His eyes took in Sarah and Emma's situation with a glance, the desperation poorly hidden behind forced optimism, the child who was trying to be brave, the woman who'd bitten off more than she could chew but was still chewing.
"You must be the new owner of the Morrison place," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd watched other city folks discover the difference between rural fantasy and rural reality. "I'm Jack Henley. This is my wife, Carol." A woman appeared behind him, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, already moving toward the kitchen before Sarah could explain their situation. "Lord have mercy," Carol muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Jack, get them inside before that child catches pneumonia. And start some coffee. They look like they've been sleeping in their car." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment and gratitude in equal measure. "We don't want to impose." "Nonsense!" Carol was already wrapping a quilt around Emma's shoulders. "When did you arrive? Where are you staying?" The questions opened floodgates Sarah hadn't realized she'd built. The whole story poured out: the eviction, the auction, the $300 gamble, the night in the car, the impossibility of everything she'd thought she could handle. Jack and Carol listened without judgment, though Sarah caught them exchanging glances that spoke of shared understanding about the Morrison property's challenges. "That old place has been empty for 15 years, Jack said when Sarah finished. "Family couldn't keep up with the maintenance after old Anna Morrison passed. Nice woman, Anna. Used to say that ranch had given her everything she needed, but it took everything she had in return." Emma looked up sharply at the name Anna, but said nothing. "The well's good," Carol added, refilling Sarah's coffee cup. "Anna had it drilled deep in the 80s, but the pump's been broken since the power got cut, and fixing it isn't cheap." They spent the morning getting practical advice that felt like a cold shower of reality. The house would need a new roof before winter, which was already knocking at the door. The electrical system was from the 1940s and probably violated every safety code written since. The propane tank for the stove was empty, and getting it refilled required a truck they didn't have to drive to a depot 40 miles away. But Jack also mentioned something that caught Sarah's attention. "Anna always said there was something special about that land. Used to talk about signs and markers, old mining claims from way back. Course, everybody's got mining stories out here. Most of them are just stories." Mining claims. Sarah filed that away, though it felt like wishful thinking to imagine their $300 disaster might somehow contain buried treasure. Carol packed them a bag of food: sandwiches, fruit, a thermos of soup, crackers for Emma. "You can't solve everything in one day," she said, pressing the bag into Sarah's hands, "but you can solve one problem at a time. Start with warmth and water. Everything else can wait." The walk back to the ranch felt shorter, maybe because Emma was chattering about the nice people they'd met, or maybe because Sarah felt less alone knowing there were neighbors who'd offer help without making her feel like a charity case. Back at the ranch, Sarah stood in the wreckage of the main house and tried to apply Carol's advice, one problem at a time. The house was uninhabitable, but there was the barn. Part of it was open to the weather, but part of it was still enclosed. If she could clear out the debris, maybe they could make a temporary shelter there. "Emma, want to help Mama clean up the barn so we can camp inside tonight?" Emma's face lit up. "Like real camping? Can we tell stories and sing songs?" "Absolutely! This is going to be the best camping trip ever!" They spent the afternoon moving debris, old hay bales that crumbled at their touch, rusty tools that belonged in a museum, boards that had once been part of stalls or shelves. Slowly, a clear space emerged, big enough for their blankets and their few possessions. Sarah found an old tarp to cover the dirt floor, and by evening they had something that resembled intentional shelter rather than accidental homelessness. As they ate Carol's soup by the light of Sarah's phone flashlight, Emma returned to the subject of their ghostly encounter. "Mama, do you think Anna, the pretty lady, really lived here?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "I think someone named Anna did live here, yes. Jack and Carol told us about her today." "And do you think she really hid treasure?"
Sarah looked around their makeshift shelter, at the broken ranch that had cost them everything they had, at the daughter who was trying so hard to be brave about their impossible situation. "I think, sweetheart, that sometimes the treasure isn't gold or money. Sometimes the treasure is learning that you're stronger than you thought you were. Sometimes it's finding out that when everything else is gone, you still have each other." Emma considered this with the seriousness children brought to important conversations. "But it would be nice if there was real treasure too, right? Just in case?" Sarah laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd managed in days. "Yes, baby, just in case there's real treasure too. That would be very nice." Outside their barn shelter, the November wind howled across their land, carrying the scent of winter and the promise of harder days ahead. But inside, wrapped in borrowed quilts and sharing the warmth of their stubborn hope, Sarah and Emma were still together, still trying, still believing that tomorrow might be the day when everything started making sense. Even if tomorrow brought nothing but more problems, more cold, more evidence of how unprepared they were for this life they'd chosen, they would face it together. And maybe, Sarah thought as Emma drifted off to sleep against her shoulder, that kind of togetherness was its own form of treasure. The kind that couldn't be bought or sold or taken away by eviction notices or cruel ex-husbands or the harsh judgment of a world that measured worth in bank balances and safety nets. Maybe Anna Morrison was right. Maybe this land did give everything you needed, as long as you were willing to give everything you had in return. Tomorrow, Sarah would start learning whether she had enough to give. The first snow came 3 weeks after they'd moved into the barn, falling in fat, lazy flakes that would have been beautiful if they hadn't represented the death of every plan Sarah had made to winterize their shelter before the weather turned deadly. She stood in the barn doorway watching the white curtain descend across their 180 acres of stubborn hope, while Emma slept fitfully behind her under every blanket they owned. 3 weeks of 18-hour days had produced some progress. They'd managed to fix the well pump with parts Jack Henley had helped them salvage from a junkyard, giving them access to water that tasted like minerals and possibility. Sarah had patched the worst holes in the barn roof with salvaged plywood and determination, creating a space that was almost warm when the wind wasn't howling. They'd even gotten the old wood stove working, burning scraps of lumber from the collapsed house and fallen fence posts that Emma helped gather each morning. But progress and survival were two different languages, and winter was fluent only in the latter. The snow kept falling, and Sarah's crone, when she could get signal by walking to the highest point on their property, showed a weather forecast that looked like a death sentence. Storm after storm lined up across the western mountains, promising weeks of snow and temperatures that would turn their barely adequate shelter into a frozen tomb. "We need to leave," she whispered to the falling snow, the words scraping against everything she told herself about resilience and determination. But leave for where? Their old apartment had been re-rented within days. The shelters in the city had waiting lists longer than winter. Sarah had burned through the last of her freelance savings buying propane, food, and basic supplies, leaving them with exactly $47 and the growing certainty that stubbornness was not a survival skill. Her phone buzzed, a miracle of technology managing to find signal in the storm. Marcus. Of course it was Marcus, calling with the supernatural timing of someone who could smell failure from 3 states away. "Sarah, I've been trying to reach you for days. Where the hell are you?" "I told you we're at the ranch." Sarah kept her voice low, not wanting to wake Emma with another fight between her parents.
"Ranch?" His laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "I drove out there yesterday, Sarah. I saw that disaster you're calling a ranch. You've lost your goddamn mind if you think I'm letting my daughter live in a barn." Sarah's blood went cold. "You were here? Yesterday?"
I parked at the end of your driveway, if you can call that pile of rocks a driveway, and saw enough. Emma is coming back to Denver with me. Tonight. Marcus, you can't just... I can and I will. I've already talked to my lawyer. Endangering a child by forcing her to live in substandard conditions is grounds for emergency custody modification. I'll be there in 2 hours with a court order. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at the phone in the swirling snow, panic rising in her throat like acid. He couldn't take Emma, could he? Sarah had no idea what her legal rights were, no money for a lawyer, no way to prove that their barn life was safe when it clearly wasn't. Mama? Emma's voice was thick with sleep, and something else, the congestion that had been getting worse each day despite Sarah's efforts to keep their space warm and dry. Who were you talking to? Sarah forced herself to smile, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. Just some business stuff, sweetheart. How are you feeling? Emma tried to sit up, then lay back down with a cough that sounded too deep, too wet. My chest feels heavy, and I'm really cold. Sarah pressed her hand to her forehead and felt the heat that meant everything was about to get much worse. Fever. Out here, 40 miles from the nearest hospital, with a storm that would make the roads impassable within hours. Okay, baby, we're going to take a little trip to town right now. But it's snowing and it's dark. I know, sweetheart, but sometimes adventures happen at night, too. Sarah moved with desperate efficiency, throwing their essential belongings into bags while her mind raced through impossible calculations. The roads were already treacherous, her car wasn't equipped for mountain winter driving, and they had barely enough gas to make it to town. But staying here with Emma sick and Marcus coming with legal papers felt like choosing between different flavors of disaster. They were loading the car when headlights cut through the falling snow, growing larger as they wound up the gravel road. Too early to be Marcus, unless he lied about the timing. Sarah's heart hammered as she recognized Jack Henley's truck, relief flooding through her so completely she nearly collapsed. Sarah! Jack's voice carried over the wind as he climbed out of his truck. Carol sent me to check on you folks. The weather service is calling for the worst storm in 20 years. Jack, thank God. Emma's sick, and my ex-husband is coming to try to take her, and I don't know what to do. Jack took one look at Emma, bundled in blankets but clearly feverish, and made the kind of quick decision that came from decades of rural emergency management. Carol's got the guest room heated and medical supplies. You can fight your legal battles from our house. Emma needs warmth and care, not a road trip in this weather. I can't ask you to, I'm telling. And if your ex-husband shows up at our place making threats, he'll find out that country hospitality has its limits. They transferred Emma to Jack's truck, which had chains and four-wheel drive and the confidence of someone who'd navigated mountain winters for 40 years. The drive to the Henley Ranch was harrowing, even in the truck, the snow falling so thick their headlights could barely penetrate 10 feet ahead. Carol had the guest room prepared like she'd been expecting them, flannel sheets and extra blankets, and a humidifier running to help with Emma's breathing. She took one look at the child and immediately started the kind of maternal fussing that made Sarah realize how long it had been since anyone had taken care of them instead of the other way around.
Honey, you're burning up, Carol murmured, helping Emma into warm pajamas. But don't you worry. Carol's going to make you some special tea and get you feeling better. While Carol tended to Emma, Jack sat Sarah down at the kitchen table with coffee that tasted like civilization and sanity. Tell me about this ex-husband situation. Sarah explained Marcus's threat, the emergency custody modification, the court order he claimed to have. Jack listened with the focused attention of someone who dealt with legal challenges before. First thing you need to know is that emergency custody changes require actual emergencies, not just situations the other parent doesn't like. Second thing is that courts don't generally favor parents who try to remove children during medical crises without consulting the custodial parent. But he's right about the living conditions. We were living in a barn, Jack. How do I defend that in court? By showing you were doing everything possible to provide for your daughter's needs in temporary circumstances. By having community support. By demonstrating that you put Emma's welfare first when she got sick. A car door slammed outside, audible even over the storm wind. Jack glanced out the window, and his expression hardened. That'll be your ex-husband. Expensive car, city plates. Probably wondering what the hell he's gotten himself into driving up here in this weather. The knock on the door was sharp, demanding. Jack opened it to reveal Marcus, snow-covered and furious, holding a folder that presumably contained the court papers that would steal Emma away. "I'm looking for Sarah Chen and my daughter Emma." Jack didn't move from the doorway. "And you are?" "Marcus Chen. I have legal documentation giving me emergency custody of my daughter." "In the middle of the night? During a blizzard? While the child is sick?" Sarah appeared behind Jack, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Hello, Marcus." Marcus looked past Jack to Sarah, his expression mixing concern and contempt in equal measure. "Sarah, you've really done it this time. Living in a barn? In the middle of nowhere? Emma could have died out there." "Emma is fine. She's being cared for by people who actually care about her welfare, not just winning arguments." "Show me your court order," Jack interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone who wasn't impressed by Marcus's expensive coat or entitled attitude. Marcus handed over the papers, which Jack read with careful attention of someone who'd served on county boards and dealt with legal documents. His expression grew thoughtful, then something approaching amused. "This isn't a court order for emergency custody. This is a motion requesting emergency custody. Filed yesterday, which means it hasn't been heard by a judge yet." Sarah felt her knees weaken with relief. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, still reading, "that Mr. Chen drove up here in a snowstorm to serve papers that don't actually give him any authority to take Emma anywhere." Marcus's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger. "The hearing is scheduled for next week. I wanted to get Emma somewhere safe before—" "She is somewhere safe." Carol's voice cut through the conversation as she appeared from the hallway. "She's in a warm bed, being treated for what looks like a mild respiratory infection, surrounded by people who care about her welfare. Where exactly did you plan to take her tonight?" "Back to Denver, to proper medical care."
In this storm? On these roads? Jack shook his head. "Son, you'd have ended up in a ditch before you made it 5 miles. Emma's safer here than she would be sliding down a mountain in your city car." Marcus looked around the Henley home, the warm lighting, the comfortable furniture, the obvious care and stability, and seemed to realize that his dramatic rescue mission had turned into something closer to a family intervention. "Sarah, this is temporary insanity. You can't live like this long term. Emma needs stability, proper schools, medical care." "Emma needs her mother," Sarah said, finding her voice and her conviction. "She needs to know that when life gets hard, we don't just give up and run back to whoever has the most money." "And what happens when the money runs out completely? When winter gets worse? When you realize that buying 180 acres of wasteland for $300 was the most irresponsible thing you've ever done?" The question hit like a physical blow, because it was exactly what Sarah asked herself every morning when she woke up cold and scared and increasingly certain that love and determination weren't enough to build a life on. But before she could answer, Emma's voice drifted from the hallway, thin with fever, but clear enough to stop all conversation. "Daddy, why are you being mean to Mama again?" Emma stood in the doorway wearing Carol's borrowed pajamas, her hair disheveled from sleep, her eyes bright with fever. She looked small and vulnerable and completely unimpressed by the adult drama playing out around her. Marcus's expression softened immediately. "Emma, sweetheart, Daddy's not being mean. Daddy's worried about you." "But Mama takes good care of me, and Miss Carol made me special tea that tastes like honey. And Mr. Jack showed me pictures of when this house was little like our barn, before they made it bigger."
Emma walked to Sarah and leaned against her legs, seeking comfort and warmth. "Mama, I don't want to go to Denver tonight. I want to stay here where it's warm. And tomorrow, I want to go back to our ranch and show you the place where Anna says the treasure is buried." Marcus looked at Sarah with something approaching panic. "Who's Anna?" "Sarah, if you've let strange people around my daughter—" "Anna's the nice lady who lived at our ranch before us. She talks to me sometimes about the treasure." The room fell silent, except for the wind howling outside and the soft tick of the mantel clock. Marcus stared at Emma with the expression of someone watching his worldview crumble in real time. "Sweetheart, there's no lady at the ranch. The ranch is empty." Emma looked at him with the pitying expression children reserve for adults who'd forgotten how to see magic. "She's not alive, Daddy. She's the kind of alive that stays in places after people go away. Like how Grandma Sarah's house still smells like her cookies, even though she's in heaven." Carol and Jack exchanged glances that spoke of shared understanding about the way children process the world. Marcus looked like he was trying to solve a math problem with insufficient data. "Sarah, we need to talk. Privately." They stepped onto the front porch, where the storm had intensified into something that belonged in disaster movies. The wind howled through the pine trees, and snow fell so thick it was like standing inside a cloud. "This is insane," Marcus said, without preamble. "Emma's talking to imaginary people. You're living in conditions that would challenge trained survivalists, and winter's just getting started. This fantasy has to end." "It's not a fantasy. It's our life. It's not sustainable. What happens when your car breaks down? When someone gets seriously hurt? When you run out of money completely?" Sarah looked out at the storm, at the landscape that had become both their salvation and their trial by fire. "Then we figure it out. The same way people figured it out for thousands of years before there were safety nets and emergency services." "You're being romantic about suffering, Sarah. There's nothing noble about putting Emma at risk to prove some point about self-reliance. And you're being dramatic about normal challenges to avoid admitting that maybe, just maybe, there are different ways to live than the one you've chosen." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, snow accumulating on his expensive coat. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost sad. "What if you're wrong? What if this doesn't work out? What if something happens to Emma because you chose pride over practicality?" The question struck at Sarah's deepest fear, that her determination to build something different was actually just elaborate self-destruction disguised as courage. "Then I'll live with the consequences," she said finally. "But I won't live with the consequences of teaching Emma that you should give up on your dreams the moment they get difficult." They stood in the snow for another minute. Two people who'd once loved each other, trying to navigate the wreckage of their shared past and their daughter's uncertain future. "The custody hearing is Tuesday. If you can't provide stable housing by then, I know. I'm not doing this to hurt you, Sarah. I'm doing it because I love Emma. I know that too." Marcus left shortly after, his expensive car sliding and struggling down the mountain road in conditions that proved Jack's point about the wisdom of travel that night. Sarah watched his taillights disappear into the storm and felt the weight of Tuesday's deadline settling onto her shoulders like lead. 5 days to create stable housing from a barn and broken buildings. 5 days to prove that her choice to bet everything on this impossible ranch wasn't actually child endangerment disguised as adventure. "Mama?" Emma had appeared beside her, wrapped in one of Carol's quilts. "Is Daddy going to take me away?" Sarah knelt to Emma's level, looking into eyes that held too much understanding for 7 years old. "Daddy's worried about us, sweetheart. He thinks we should go back to the city where things are easier." "But things weren't easier in the city. Things were scary there too." Emma was right.
The city had been full of different terrors. Eviction notices and empty refrigerators, and the constant pressure of barely keeping their heads above water. At least here, the challenges were honest. The cold didn't pretend to be anything other than cold. The broken roof didn't disguise itself as something functional. "Emma, do you want to stay here, on our ranch, even though it's hard?" "I want to stay because this is where we're building something together. And Anna says the treasure isn't just gold, it's the feeling you get when you find out you're stronger than you thought you were." Sarah pulled Emma close, breathing in the scent of Carol's lavender soap and her daughter's unshakable faith in their impossible dream. "Then we'll stay, and we'll figure out how to make it work." They spent the next 4 days in a frenzy of preparation that bordered on desperation. Jack and Carol had offered to let them stay in the guest room permanently, but Sarah knew that wouldn't satisfy a court looking for evidence of independent stability. They needed to make their own place livable, not just temporarily bearable. Jack arrived each morning with tools and expertise, helping Sarah frame out insulated walls in the barn, install a proper electrical connection from a generator, and create something that resembled intentional living space rather than emergency shelter. Carol appeared with supplies: insulation, drywall, paint, curtains that transformed raw space into something approaching home.
"Why are you helping us?" Sarah asked on Thursday morning as she and Jack worked to install windows salvaged from a house demolition in town. Jack was quiet for a long moment, measuring twice before cutting into the barn wall. 40 years ago, Carol and I bought this place with nothing but hope and stubbornness. First winter, we nearly froze to death. In the second winter, we nearly starved. Third winter, we figured out how to make it work. He lined up the window frame with the precision of someone who'd learned that good enough wasn't good enough when survival was at stake. Every person who makes it out here had to have somebody believe in them long enough for them to believe in themselves. Our somebody was Anna Morrison. She brought us food when we were too proud to ask, taught Carol how to preserve vegetables, helped me learn which parts of ranching you could postpone and which ones would kill you if you ignored them. Sarah stopped working, struck by the connection. "You knew Anna?" Anna Morrison was the heart of this community for 60 years. When she lost the ranch, it felt like losing the center of something important. When you bought her place, it felt like maybe that center could exist again. The windows slid into place with a satisfying thunk, and suddenly, the barn had natural light streaming across their workspace. Anna used to say that the land chose its people as much as people chose the land. Maybe she was right. Friday morning brought clear skies and temperatures that promised the snow might melt enough for the roads to be passable by Tuesday. Sarah stood in their transformed barn, trying to see it through the eyes of a judge who would decide Emma's fate in 3 days. They'd created 2 rooms, a main living area with the wood stove, kitchen area, and dining space, and a smaller bedroom where Emma's bed sat next to Sarah's, separated by a curtain for privacy. The walls were insulated and painted, the floors covered with rugs Carol had contributed, the windows letting in light that made everything feel less like camping and more like home. It wasn't perfect. The bathroom was still an outhouse Jack had helped them build behind the barn. The kitchen was a propane camping stove and a cooler. The heating system was wood they had to cut and split themselves. But it was clean, warm, safe, and undeniably theirs. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Sarah asked Emma, who was arranging her books on the shelf Jack had built into the wall. "It feels like home," Emma said simply. "But Mama, I think we should show the judge where Anna says the treasure is. Even if we can't find it, maybe he'll understand that we're not just living here, we're looking for something important." Sarah had been avoiding the subject of Emma's conversations with Anna Morrison, partly because she didn't know how to explain them to herself, much less to a skeptical court system. But Emma's certainty was unshakable, and her descriptions were becoming more detailed and specific. "Where does Anna say the treasure is, baby?" Emma walked to the barn door and pointed toward a section of their property where the land rose into a small hill covered with scrub oak and wild grass. "Up there, where the rocks make a circle. She says her grandfather buried things there during the bad times, and the earth has been keeping them safe ever since." Sarah followed Emma's pointing finger to a spot she'd noticed during their early explorations, an area where the vegetation seemed different, where rocks did indeed form something approaching a circle. She'd assumed it was just a natural formation, but looking at it now, with Emma's certainty to guide her vision, she could see how it might be something more deliberate. "Anna says we should dig there before the court man comes. She says sometimes you have to prove to grown-ups that magic is real before they'll believe in regular things like love and homes and families." Saturday morning, with the custody hearing looming 48 hours away, Sarah found herself doing something that felt either like inspired faith or complete insanity, following her 7-year-old daughter up a hillside to dig for treasure based on conversations with a ghost.
Jack had loaned them a metal detector and some basic digging tools, though his expression suggested he thought they were engaging in therapeutic displacement activity rather than actual treasure hunting. Carol had packed them a lunch and wished them luck with the tone of someone humoring a harmless delusion. The circle of rocks was more obvious up close, too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. Emma walked directly to the center and pointed to a spot where the ground seemed slightly different, more compacted, as if it had been disturbed and carefully restored. "Here," she said with absolute certainty. "Anna says here." Sarah fired up the metal detector and began sweeping it across the area Emma had indicated. For 20 minutes, nothing but the occasional beer can or piece of farm equipment. Then, just as Sarah was beginning to feel foolish for following ghost directions, the detector began beeping with increasing intensity. Something was definitely buried here. Something large and metallic and about 3 feet down. "Mama, you found it!" Emma's excitement was infectious, and despite herself, Sarah felt her heart rate accelerating as she began to dig. The soil was harder than expected, clay-like and stubborn, requiring real effort to move. But as she dug deeper, her shovel began hitting something that definitely wasn't rock or root, something that felt smooth and deliberate. After an hour of digging, she'd uncovered the corner of what appeared to be a metal strongbox, old but intact, buried with the kind of care that suggested valuable contents. "Emma, I think you might be right about this treasure." It took another hour to excavate the box completely, a military surplus strongbox from the 1940s, heavy enough to suggest substantial contents, locked but not rusted through. Emma danced around the hole with excitement while Sarah stared at their discovery, trying to process what this might mean. "Anna says there's more," Emma announced as if reading Sarah's thoughts. "She says this is just the beginning. She says the real treasure is deeper, but we'll need bigger machines to find it." Sarah carried the strongbox back to the barn, her mind racing with possibilities and cautions in equal measure. Whatever was inside could change everything or nothing. It might be family heirlooms worth hundreds of dollars, or it might be something that justified the hope that it carried them this far. As the sun set on Sunday evening with the custody hearing scheduled for 10 a.m. Tuesday morning, Sarah sat on their porch. Jack had helped them build a small, covered entrance to the barn, and stared at the locked strongbox. Tomorrow, she would take the box to town and find a locksmith. Monday, she would prepare for the most important conversation of her life, one that would determine whether she got to keep building this impossible dream or whether it all crumbled into evidence of her unfitness as a mother. But tonight, for the first time since they'd arrived at the ranch, Sarah felt something that might have been actual hope instead of desperate optimism. Whatever was in that box, they'd found it together. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of treasure that mattered most. Even if the court disagreed, even if Marcus won, even if their adventure ended with Emma being taken away to safety and stability and everything Sarah couldn't provide, they'd had this. They'd had the experience of betting everything on something impossible and discovering that sometimes impossible things became possible if you were willing to dig deep enough to find them. The stars above their 180 acres of stubborn hope seemed brighter than they'd ever been in the city, and for the first time in months, Sarah fell asleep without the weight of certain failure pressing against her chest. Tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow brought, but tonight they had treasure. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of winter day that made the mountains look like a postcard advertising the American dream. Sarah stood outside the Cedar Falls hardware store, waiting for old Pete Morrison, Anna's great-nephew and the closest thing the town had to a locksmith, to arrive and help them open the strongbox that might contain their salvation or their final disappointment.
Emma pressed her face against the hardware store window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered at the tools and supplies that represented the difference between surviving and thriving in rural Montana. She'd been unusually quiet since they'd found the box, as if the weight of what they'd discovered was finally settling into her 7-year-old understanding of cause and effect. "Mama, what if it's empty?" Emma asked, voicing the fear that had kept Sarah awake most of the night. "What if Anna was wrong about the treasure?" "Then we'll still have each other, and we'll still have our ranch, and we'll figure out another way," Sarah replied, though her own faith was wearing thin. Tomorrow's custody hearing loomed like a thundercloud, and without some kind of dramatic evidence that their life was sustainable, Marcus would likely win his case for taking Emma back to Denver. Pete Morrison arrived in a pickup truck that looked older than Sarah, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw them waiting. He'd agreed to help partly out of curiosity about what Anna might have left behind, and partly because the whole town was invested in the story of the city woman who'd bought the Morrison Ranch for $300. "Morning, ladies. Let's see what old Anna left for you." They moved to the back of the store, where Pete had set up a workbench with the tools needed to carefully open the locked strongbox without damaging whatever might be inside. The box itself was impressive. Military surplus from World War II, built to withstand everything from combat conditions to decades buried in Montana soil. Anna's grandfather was quite a character, Pete said, as he examined the lock mechanism. "Samuel Morrison. Came out here in 1892, convinced there was gold in them hills. Spent 40 years looking for it, found enough to keep hope alive, but never enough to make him rich." Sarah felt Emma stiffen beside her at the mention of gold, but she kept her expression neutral. Anna's conversations with Anna had mentioned treasure, but they'd never specified what kind. Pete worked with the patience of someone who'd spent 70 years fixing things that other people had given up on. The lock was old but well-made, designed to keep secrets rather than simply inconvenience thieves. After 20 minutes of careful manipulation, something clicked, and the lid opened with a whisper of hinges that had waited decades to fulfill their purpose. The first thing they saw was oilcloth, carefully wrapped around objects that had been protected from moisture and time. Pete lifted the cloth with reverent hands, revealing contents that made all three of them catch their breath. Maps, hand-drawn, detailed, precise maps of the Morrison Ranch property, with notations in faded ink that spoke of careful observation and methodical exploration. But these weren't just property surveys, they were treasure maps in the most literal sense, marked with symbols and measurements and notes that documented a lifetime of searching. "Jesus, Mary and Joseph," Pete whispered, spreading the largest map across his workbench. "Sarah, I think you need to see this." The map showed their property in incredible detail, with every hill and valley, every stream and rock formation marked with the precision of someone who'd walked every acre multiple times. But what made Sarah's heart start racing were dozens of small X marks scattered across the map, each accompanied by notes in Samuel Morrison's careful handwriting. "Promising quartz formation, 50 feet northeast of Oak Grove. Gold flakes in stream sample. Spring runoff 1923. Significant color in pan. Follow vein up slope. Mother lode. Survey markers point here. Need equipment." Emma pointed to a spot on the map that looked familiar. "Mama, that's where we found the box. See, it says Cache Point 1. Supplies and maps for final push."
Sarah followed Emma's finger to other markings on the map, her pulse quickening as she realized what they were looking at. This wasn't just a treasure map. It was a geological survey conducted over decades by someone who'd found evidence of gold throughout their property, but it never had the resources to properly extract it. The largest X was marked near the eastern border of their land, accompanied by notes that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Primary vein confirmed, 1934. Assay shows 0.8 ounces per ton surface samples. Depth unknown. Requires professional extraction. Markers placed for future development. Pete looked up from the map with wonder in his eyes. Sarah, if these surveys are accurate, you might be sitting on something substantial. Beneath the maps were other items that told the story of Samuel Morrison's lifelong quest. Sample vials containing flakes of actual gold, carefully labeled with dates and locations. A leather journal documenting 40 years of prospecting notes. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in another layer of oilcloth, something that made Pete Morrison whistle low. "That's a professional geological survey from 1938, he said, handling the document with the care reserved for historical artifacts. Cost a fortune in those days. Samuel must have saved for years to afford this. Sarah read over his shoulder, trying to understand the technical language that might determine her daughter's future. The survey was dense with geological terminology, but certain phrases jumped out like headlines. Significant mineralization indicated throughout the property. The primary vein extends approximately 2.3 miles along the eastern boundary. Conservative estimates suggest commercial viability. Recommend immediate development pending capital investment. Emma, Sarah said quietly, I think Anna was right about the treasure. But even as excitement began to build, practical concerns crowded in. Professional geological surveys and hand-drawn maps were one thing, but proving there was actually extractable gold on their property was another matter entirely. And they had less than 24 hours before Marcus's custody hearing could take Emma away before any of this mattered. Pete, what would it take to confirm whether there's really gold here? Pete considered the question with the deliberation of someone who'd watched dreams rise and fall on the promise of precious metals. Modern assay work, core samples, professional equipment, probably looking at $10,000 minimum for a proper survey. And even then, you'd need environmental permits, mining rights documentation, capital for extraction equipment. Sarah's heart sank. $10,000 might as well have been $10 million. They had $47 in cash and a custody hearing tomorrow morning. But, Pete continued, there might be another way. These old-timers knew their business, and Samuel Morrison was as thorough as they come. If he marked a spot as significant, there's probably something there you could verify with basic equipment. Emma had been studying the map with the focused intensity she usually reserved for picture books, tracing the lines and symbols with her finger. Suddenly, she looked up with the expression that meant she'd figured something out. Mama, Anna wants us to go to the big X first. She says we need to see what's there before the court man comes. Sarah looked at the map, at the spot marked as the primary vein, then at her daughter's face bright with certainty that defied adult skepticism.
Pete, do you have equipment we could borrow, just for basic prospecting? I've got pans, a pick, basic tools. And I'll tell you what, I'm curious enough about this to come with you. It's been 40 years since anyone seriously looked for gold on Morrison land. They spent Sunday afternoon at the location marked on Samuel Morrison's map, a section of their property Sarah had barely explored because it seemed like just another hill covered with scrub oak and mountain grass. But seen through the lens of the map, the landscape revealed secrets that had been hiding in plain sight. A rocky outcropping that looked random from a distance showed clear signs of deliberate excavation when examined closely. Someone had been digging here, following a vein of quartz that ran through the exposed rock like a white scar against the darker stone. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete muttered, examining the rock face with a geologist's eye. Samuel was onto something. Look at this. He pointed to places where the quartz was stained with colors that didn't belong. Green oxidation that suggested copper, black staining that might indicate silver, and most promising of all, a metallic glint that caught the afternoon sunlight. Is that? Sarah couldn't bring herself to say the word. Could be. Let's find out.
Pete broke off several samples of the stained quartz using techniques that looked more scientific than Sarah had expected. He crushed small pieces in a specialized mortar, then carefully panned the resulting material in a portable pan designed for field testing. The first few samples yielded nothing but rock dust and disappointment, but the fourth sample, taken from a section where the staining was most pronounced, produced something that Pete's hands shook. "Sarah, come look at this." In the bottom of the pan, separated from the crushed rock by careful washing, were several flakes of unmistakable gold. Not just traces or wishful thinking, actual, visible, real gold. "How much?" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. "From this small sample? Maybe $50 worth. But Sarah, that's surface material, weathered and scattered. If there's this much color in a random surface sample, the vein below—" Pete trailed off, staring at the golden flakes as if they might disappear if he spoke too loudly. Emma had been collecting interesting rocks while the adults worked, but now she approached the excavation site with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. "Anna says we need to dig deeper right here," she announced, pointing to a spot about 6 feet from where Pete had taken his samples. "She says that's where her grandpa found the really good stuff but couldn't get it out by himself." Sarah looked at the spot Emma indicated, then at Pete, who was studying the geological formations with new understanding. "Actually," Pete said slowly, "that makes sense. If the primary vein runs along this ridge and the surface samples show this much color, then the richest deposits would be—" He moved to exactly the spot Emma had indicated. "Right about here." They dug for 2 hours, taking turns with the pick and shovel, following Pete's guidance about how to trace a vein through rock and soil. Emma helped by carrying away debris and arranging the rocks according to a system only she understood. At 18 inches deep, Pete's pick struck something that rang like metal against metal. He cleared away the soil carefully, revealing a section of pure quartz vein that was nearly 6 inches wide and stained with metallic deposits throughout its visible length. "Jesus Christ!" Pete breathed, and then immediately apologized to Emma for the language. "Sorry, sweetheart, but I think your mama just found herself a real honest-to-God gold mine."
He extracted a sample from the exposed vein, and this time the panning process yielded results that left all 3 of them staring in silence. The bottom of the pan was covered with gold flakes, not just traces, but enough to see clearly without squinting. "Pete, what does this mean in practical terms?" Pete was quiet for a long moment, studying the vein, the samples, and the documentation from Samuel Morrison's decades of careful research. "In practical terms, it means you need to call a professional geologist first thing tomorrow morning, but Sarah—" He paused, as if afraid to say what he was thinking. "If this vein extends as far as Samuel's surveys suggest, and if the gold content remains consistent throughout the deposit, you might be looking at something that could change your life completely." "How complete?" $1 million completely, maybe more depending on current gold prices and extraction costs. Sarah sat down heavily on a nearby rock, trying to process what Pete was telling her. 18 hours before a custody hearing that could take Emma away, they'd discovered evidence of enough gold to solve every financial problem they ever had. But even as excitement built, practical concerns crowded in. Legal procedures, environmental permits, mining rights, equipment costs. The gap between finding gold and being able to extract it profitably might be unbridgeable for someone with $47 in the bank. "Emma, sweetheart, we need to get back to town and make some phone calls. Can you help Mama gather up all these rock samples?" As they loaded Pete's truck with evidence of their discovery, Sarah's phone finally found enough signal to ring. Marcus, of course, calling to discuss tomorrow's hearing with the timing that suggested supernatural awareness of when his calls would cause maximum stress. "Sarah, I wanted to talk before tomorrow about the custody arrangement." "What about it?" "I've been thinking about what you said, about teaching Emma not to give up on dreams when they get difficult, and I want you to know that even if the court decides she should live with me, you'll always be part of her life." Sarah looked at the truck full of rock samples, at Emma carefully arranging the gold-bearing quartz specimens, and Pete Morrison grinning like someone who'd witnessed a miracle. "Marcus, I need to tell you something. Something's changed since we talked." "Changed how?" "We found something on the ranch, something that might change everything about our situation." A pause that felt loaded with skepticism. "Found what exactly?" Sarah took a breath, knowing how this would sound but needing to say it anyway. "Gold, Marcus. We found gold." The silence that followed was so complete she thought the call had dropped. "Sarah, please tell me you're not calling the night before our custody hearing to tell me you think you've struck it rich." "I'm not telling you I think I've struck it rich. I'm telling you we've confirmed there's gold vein on our property, a significant one." "Confirmed how? By whom?" "Sarah, this sounds like desperation talking." Pete took the phone from Sarah's hands before she could respond. "This is Pete Morrison, Mr. Chen. I'm a 70-year mining engineer, and I've spent the afternoon testing samples from your ex-wife's property. She's not making this up." Another long pause.
"And your professional opinion?" "My professional opinion is that Sarah's sitting on a deposit that could be worth anywhere from $1 million to $50 million, depending on extent and extraction costs. And that's a conservative estimate based on preliminary field testing." Sarah could hear Marcus breathing on the other end of the line, processing information that didn't fit into any of the categories his legal training had prepared him for. "I'll be at the hearing tomorrow as scheduled," he said finally. "But Sarah, if this is real, if you've actually found something substantial, we need to talk about Emma's security in completely different terms." "I know, but Marcus, whatever happens tomorrow, Emma and I are staying together, on our ranch. That's non-negotiable." After Marcus hung up, they drove back to town in Pete's truck, Emma dozing against Sarah's shoulder, while Pete chattered excitedly about geological formations and extraction possibilities, and the kind of professional verification they'd need to move forward. "Pete, what happens now, realistically?" "Realistically, you call every geologist and mining engineer within 500 miles and get proper surveys done. You contact a mining lawyer to help with permits and environmental compliance. You probably need to bring in investors or partners, unless you've got several $1 million sitting around for equipment." Sarah laughed, though it came out more like a sob. "Pete, this morning I had $47. The idea of $1 million investments is completely surreal." "Sarah, that's how these things work. You find the gold, then you find the money to get the gold. If the deposits are as significant as they appear, financing won't be the problem. Managing the process will be." They spent Sunday evening in the Henley kitchen, Pete's rock samples spread across Carol's dining table like evidence in a treasure hunt come to life. Jack and Carol listened to the story with the wonder of people who'd watched their neighbors struggle for weeks, only to discover she'd been sitting on a fortune the entire time. "Anna Morrison always said that ranch would provide for whoever loved it enough," Carol mused, examining a piece of gold-bearing quartz through a magnifying glass. "Guess she was right." Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted by the day's adventure, but smiling in her sleep as if her dreams were full of treasure and vindication. Sarah sat beside her daughter, trying to process the possibility that tomorrow's custody hearing might be taking place in a completely different universe than the one she'd been preparing for. Monday morning brought news that changed everything again. Pete had spent the evening making phone calls to colleagues in the mining industry, and by 8 a.m. he was knocking on the Henleys' door with information that left Sarah speechless. "I sent photos of your samples to a friend who runs assays for major mining companies. Sarah, sit down for this. The preliminary estimates were conservative. Based on the visible gold content and the vein structure, we're looking at deposits that could yield anywhere from $50 to $200 million worth of extractable gold." Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. $200 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real, like a figure from a lottery drawing or a movie about other people's lives. "Sarah, are you sure?" "I'm sure enough that 3 different mining companies want to send teams to your property this week. And Sarah, they're talking about offering you partnerships that would set you and Emma up for life, regardless of what the court decides today." The custody hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the Cedar Falls courthouse. the same building where Sarah had bought the ranch 6 weeks earlier for $300. She arrived with Emma, Pete Morrison, and a briefcase full of geological surveys and assay reports that documented the discovery of what might be one of the richest gold deposits found in Montana in the past 50 years. Marcus was already there with his lawyer, a polished woman from Denver who looked like she'd never had a conversation about quartz veins or mineral rights. They'd prepared for a hearing about housing conditions and financial stability, not about a discovery that could make all their arguments irrelevant. Judge Patricia Hendricks had been hearing family law cases in rural Montana for 20 years, and she'd developed a reputation for cutting through emotional drama to focus on children's best interests. She listened to Marcus's concerns about living conditions, reviewed the documentation about the ranch improvements, and seemed prepared to render a decision based on traditional custody factors. Then Pete Morrison asked to address the court. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that the financial concerns underlying this custody petition may no longer be relevant." For the next 20 minutes, Pete explained the weekend's discoveries with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades evaluating mineral deposits. He presented maps, samples, professional assessments, and preliminary offers from mining companies that wanted to partner with Sarah for extraction rights. "Your Honor, in my professional opinion, Miss Chen's property contains gold deposits worth between $50 million and $200 million. She's gone from being indigent to being one of the wealthiest landowners in Montana, all in the space of 48 hours. Judge Hendricks looked from Pete to Sarah to Marcus, clearly trying to process information that belonged in mining journals rather than family court. "Ms. Chen, can you explain how this discovery affects your ability to provide for Emma's needs?" Sarah stood, feeling surreal about addressing a court while potentially sitting on a fortune that could buy half the county. "Your Honor, 6 weeks ago, I bought that ranch because it was all I could afford, and I thought it might give Emma and me a chance to build something together. I had no idea about the gold, but finding it doesn't change what I wanted for Emma. A life where she learns that you don't give up when things get hard, that you can create something beautiful even when everyone tells you it's impossible." She looked at Emma, who was sitting quietly in the front row, still clutching the stuffed elephant that had survived every move and every crisis. "The money means Emma will have security, education, opportunities. But the ranch means she'll have roots, community, and the knowledge that sometimes crazy dreams turn out to be the most practical choices you can make." Marcus stood to respond, and Sarah could see him struggling to argue against his daughter living in a home that might be worth more than his entire law firm. "Your Honor, I'm not disputing the significance of this discovery, but gold in the ground isn't the same as stable living conditions for a 7-year-old child. Sarah still needs to prove she can manage this responsibly." Judge Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, studying the documentation Pete had presented alongside the original custody petition. "Mr. Chen, in your opinion, would Emma be better served living in Denver while her mother manages what appears to be a substantial business opportunity, or remaining with her mother as these developments unfold?" Marcus looked at Emma, who was watching the adult conversation with the serious attention children brought to decisions that would shape their lives. "Emma, sweetheart, what do you want?" Emma stood up with the formal posture she used for school presentations. "I want to stay with Mama on our ranch. Anna says the treasure was always meant for people who loved the land enough to take care of it. And Mama loves it. She loves it enough to fix broken things and learn hard stuff and not give up, even when everyone said we should." Judge Hendricks smiled, the first time her expression had softened during the entire hearing. "Emma, who's Anna?" "Anna Morrison. She lived on our ranch before us, and she talks to me sometimes. She says families are like treasure. The more you're willing to dig for them, the more beautiful they become." The courtroom was silent. except for the soft sound of Pete Morrison wiping tears from his eyes. Judge Hendricks announced her decision 15 minutes later. This court finds that Emma's best interests are served by remaining in her mother's custody. The evidence suggests that Ms. Chen has not only provided stable housing, but has also demonstrated the kind of determination and resourcefulness that will serve Emma well as they navigate significant life changes together. She looked directly at Sarah. "Ms. Chen, you've been given an extraordinary opportunity. I trust you'll use it wisely, not just for financial security, but to continue building the kind of home where children learn that persistence and love can overcome almost any obstacle." As they walked out of the courthouse, Sarah slipped her hand into Sarah's sleeve. "Mama, Anna says to tell you she's proud, and she says the real treasure isn't the gold, it's that we proved families don't break just because things get hard." Sarah looked across the street at Pete's truck, loaded with rock samples that represented more money than she'd ever imagined having. Then she looked down at Emma, who was smiling with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in impossible things had been completely vindicated. "What do you think, sweetheart? Ready to go home to our ranch? Our ranch with the treasure? Our ranch with all kinds of treasure." Epilogue, 5 years later. The Morrison Center for Rural Family Resilience now helps dozens of families each year transition from crisis to stability. Sarah and Marcus co-parent Emma, who at 12 serves as student speaker at the center's graduations, sharing how the craziest dreams often become the most practical choices. The gold mining partnership with Titan yielded exactly what the surveys predicted, funding not only their security, but a legacy of second chances for families willing to bet everything on hope and hard work. And somewhere in the Montana air above their thriving ranch, Anna Morrison's promise continues. The land gives everything to those who love it enough to give everything in return. 6 months after the custody hearing that changed everything, Sarah stood on the front porch of their completed house watching Emma feed carrots to the horses they'd bought from a ranch 30 miles south. The house, a real house now, with running water and electricity and rooms that had been designed rather than improvised, occupied the spot where the old Morrison homestead had crumbled. Built with timber from their own land and a view that stretched all the way to the Continental Divide. The morning sun caught the solar panels Jack Henley had helped them install, the same way that it illuminated the restored barn that now served as both equipment storage and a reminder of where they'd started. Everything about the ranch spoke of careful planning and quality construction, but also of respect for the land's history and the people who'd loved it before them. "Emma, Shadow's being greedy again," Emma called from the pasture, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd learned to handle horses with the same determination she'd once applied to surviving in a broken-down barn. Shadow, the black gelding they'd rescued from an auction, had indeed commandeered most of the carrots while the other horses watched with equine resignation.
"Tell him he needs to share, or no more treats after dinner," Sarah called back, marveling at how normal this conversation sounded 6 months after they'd been living in their car and wondering where their next meal would come from. The mining operation had transformed their eastern pasture into something that looked like a cross between an archaeological dig and a high-tech laboratory. Titan Mining, the company they'd eventually partnered with after weeks of negotiations that felt like diplomatic summits, had brought in equipment worth more than the GDP of some small countries. The extraction process was surprisingly clean and precise, nothing like the strip mining Sarah had feared would devastate the landscape. Instead, Titan's engineers had developed a plan that extracted the gold while actually improving the land's long-term stability. Water quality was better than it had been in decades. Wildlife had returned to areas that had been barren when they'd arrived. The mining operation employed 43 people from the surrounding community, turning Cedar Falls from a dying town into a place where young families could build futures.
Sarah's partnership agreement with Titan gave her 40% of the extracted gold's value, plus complete control over environmental standards and community impact decisions. Conservative estimates suggested the deposit would yield approximately $180 million over the next 15 years, making her one of the wealthiest landowners in Montana, while ensuring that Emma would never face the kind of financial uncertainty that had driven them to the ranch in the first place. But watching Emma with the horses, Sarah realized that the money, life-changing as it was, had turned out to be less important than everything else they'd discovered along the way. "She's gotten tall," Marcus observed, settling into the porch chair beside Sarah's. These Sunday morning visits had become routine over the past 3 months, a development that would have seemed impossible during those desperate early weeks, but now felt as natural as the rhythm of rural life. "She's growing like a weed," Sarah agreed, accepting the coffee he'd brought from town. "Dr. Martinez says she's gained 12 pounds since the custody hearing and grown 3 inches. Amazing what regular meals and fresh air can do." Marcus watched Emma with the expression of someone still adjusting to fundamental changes in his understanding of what constituted a good life for his daughter. The Denver law firm, the expensive apartment, the private schools he'd planned for Emma, all of that had been reconsidered in light of watching her thrive in ways that couldn't be measured by traditional success metrics. "She's confident," he said, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "I mean, she was always smart, but now she's, I don't know, fearless? Like she knows something the rest of us are still learning." Sarah knew what he meant. Emma carried herself differently now, with the assurance of someone who'd been tested by circumstances beyond her control and discovered she was stronger than anyone had imagined. She spoke to adults as equals, made decisions with careful consideration, and approached challenges with curiosity rather than fear. I think she learned that the world doesn't end when things get hard, and maybe that the best adventures are the ones that scare other people. Speaking of adventures that scare other people, how are the mining negotiations going? Titan wants to expand the operation to include the northern section of the property. Their surveys suggest there might be an even larger deposit up there. Sarah gestured toward the hills where Emma claimed Anna Morrison appeared most frequently. "But I'm not sure I want to disturb that area." "Because of Emma's ghost friend?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Over the past 6 months, she'd stopped trying to explain or rationalize Emma's conversations with Anna Morrison. Whether Anna was imagination, intuition, or something more mysterious didn't matter as much as the wisdom that seemed to emerge from those conversations.
Because Emma's right that some places are sacred, and you don't mess with them just because you can afford to. Marcus nodded, accepting Sarah's reasoning with the equanimity he developed since realizing that his ex-wife's seemingly impractical choices had turned out to be the most practical decisions anyone in their family had ever made. "Have you thought about what you want to do long-term? I mean, beyond the mining operation?" Sarah had been thinking about exactly that question for weeks. The immediate concerns, housing, financial security, Emma's future, had been resolved beyond their wildest expectations. But success, she was learning, brought its own set of challenges and decisions. "I want to build something that lasts beyond us," she said finally. Anna Morrison's family lived on this land for 60 years. They loved it, worked it, protected it. I want Emma to have that same foundation, but I also want other people to have access to what we've found here." "What do you mean?" Sarah pointed toward the renovated barn, where construction crews were adding space for what would become the Morrison Center for Rural Family Resilience, a program Sarah had designed to help other single parents transition to sustainable rural living. "The gold is going to run out eventually, but the land will be here forever, and there will always be families who need second chances. I want to create something that helps people who are where we were 6 months ago, desperate, discouraged, but still hoping that impossible dreams might be possible. The Morrison Center was Sarah's attempt to ensure that their remarkable story became a beginning rather than an ending. The program would provide tiny homes for transitional housing, vocational training in sustainable agriculture and rural trades, childcare support, and mentorship from families who'd successfully made the transition from urban struggle to rural stability. Titan Mining had agreed to fund the program's initial development as part of their community investment commitments. The state of Montana was providing additional support, viewing the Morrison Center as a model for rural revitalization that other communities could replicate. Emma suggested the name. She said Anna would like knowing that her ranch was helping other families find their treasure. Marcus looked thoughtful, studying the landscape that had become his daughter's world, and increasingly, a place he was learning to understand and respect. Sarah, I need to tell you something. About the custody hearing, about everything that's happened since. Sarah waited, recognizing the tone Marcus used when he was preparing to say something important. I was wrong, not just about the ranch or the living conditions or your ability to provide for Emma. I was wrong about what providing for her really means. He gestured toward Emma, who was now leading Shadow around the pasture with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that large animals would respect and respond to clear, gentle guidance. She needed to know she could handle hard things, Sarah said softly. She needed to know that her family wouldn't break just because circumstances got difficult.
And I needed to learn that security isn't the same thing as safety, and safety isn't the same thing as love. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Emma work with the horses while the morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold that reminded Sarah every single day of how much their lives had changed. Marcus, there's something I want to ask you. Anything. How would you feel about spending Emma's summer vacation here? Not visiting. I mean, really staying, learning the ranch work, being part of what we're building. Marcus looked surprised, then thoughtful, then something approaching excited. You mean like a working ranch vacation? I mean like being part of Emma's life in the place where she's choosing to build her future. She's going to inherit all of this someday. The land, the mining rights, the Morrison Center, everything. I want her to share it with people she loves, not just manage it alone. The idea had been forming in Sarah's mind for weeks, but saying it aloud made it feel real and right. Emma deserved to have both parents present for the adventure of her life, even if that adventure looked nothing like what any of them had originally planned. I'd have to arrange things with the firm, maybe work remotely for part of the summer. Marcus, Titan's legal team could use local support for environmental compliance issues, and the Morrison Center is going to need help with liability and regulatory frameworks. If you wanted to practice law here part-time, there's definitely work. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, processing an offer that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, but now felt inevitable. Are you offering me a job, Sarah Chen? I'm offering you a chance to be part of something bigger than any of us imagined when we started. Emma's voice interrupted their conversation, calling from the pasture with the excitement that meant she'd discovered something important. Mama, Mr. Marcus, come see what Shadow found. They walked to the pasture where Emma was standing next to a section of fence line that bordered the area where the original gold discovery had taken place. Shadow was pawing at the ground with the intensity horses usually reserved for finding choice grass, but this spot looked different, disturbed in a way that suggested something buried just beneath the surface. What do you think it is, sweetheart? Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Anna says it's another cache. She says Shadow's got a nose for treasure because he used to belong to prospectors before we rescued him. Sarah looked at Marcus, who was studying the spot Shadow had identified with the expression of someone who'd learned not to dismiss apparently impossible explanations. "Well," Marcus said finally, "I guess we'd better get some shovels." An hour of careful digging revealed another strongbox, smaller than the first, but containing items that made Sarah understand the true scope of Anna Morrison's legacy. Inside were more maps, but these weren't geological surveys. They were detailed plans for sustainable land use, water conservation, wildlife management, and community development that Anna had been working on for decades. There were also photographs, dozens of them, showing the ranch through different seasons and different eras. Images of children playing in the same pasture where Emma now worked with horses. Images of community gatherings, barn raisings, harvest celebrations, and the kind of rural social fabric that had sustained families through generations of challenges.
And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture and time, was a letter addressed to the family who comes after. Sarah read the letter aloud, while Emma and Marcus listened with the attention reserved for messages from the past that spoke directly to present concerns. If you're reading this, it means the land chose you the way it chose us. Samuel and I spent 40 years learning that the real treasure wasn't the gold we found, but the life we built looking for it. The gold gave us security, but the land gave us purpose. Take care of both, and they'll take care of you. The plans in this box represent everything we learned about making this place sustainable for generations. The photographs show you're not the first family to struggle here, and you won't be the last. But everyone who's loved this land has added something beautiful to it, and now it's your turn. Don't let the money change what brought you here. Don't let success make you forget why you stayed when things were impossible. And don't let anyone tell you that loving a place and loving each other isn't practical. It's the most practical thing in the world. The children in these photographs grew up to be teachers, farmers, doctors, artists, and adventurers, but they all carried something with them from this land, the knowledge that roots run deep, that communities matter, and that sometimes the craziest dreams turn out to be the most sensible choices. Build something beautiful. Share it with people who need second chances, and remember that every generation gets to be pioneers if they're brave enough to love something bigger than themselves. Welcome home. Anna Morrison, 1995. Sarah folded the letter with hands that shook slightly, overwhelmed by the sense of connection to a woman she'd never met, but who'd understood exactly what this place could mean to a family willing to bet everything on impossible possibilities. She knew, Emma said simply. Anna knew we were coming, and she left us everything we needed to make it work. Marcus was studying the photographs with the fascination of someone discovering that their family's story was part of a much larger narrative. Sarah, these development plans, they're basically a blueprint for everything you're trying to do with the Morrison Center. Land use, water rights, community partnerships, educational programs. Anna Morrison was designing rural sustainability programs 60 years before anyone was calling them that. Sarah looked around the ranch, at the completed house that honored the land's history while embracing modern efficiency, at the mining operation that was extracting wealth while improving environmental conditions, at Emma, who was learning to be fearless and practical in equal measure. I think that Anna Morrison was a lot smarter about the relationship between dreams and reality than anyone realized, including us. That evening, as they often did now, the three of them sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in colors that looked like hope and satisfaction and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong.
Emma was working on a school project about family history, using Anna Morrison's photographs to create a timeline of the ranch's development over the past century. Her teacher had been so impressed with the project that she'd ask Emma to present it to the State Historical Society as an example of how local history could illuminate broader patterns of Western development. "Mama, do you think Anna is proud of what we've done with her ranch?"
Sarah considered the question while watching the mining operations lights twinkle in the distance, the evidence of wealth being extracted from earth that had waited decades for the right family to discover its secrets. "I think Anna's proud that we didn't let the money change what we came here to find." What did we come here to find? Each other, a home, the knowledge that we could handle whatever life threw at us if we faced it together. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a man who'd learned that success could be measured in ways that didn't appear on financial statements. "And I think she's proud that we're sharing it. The Morrison Center, the community partnerships, the jobs for local people. None of this is just about us anymore." Emma nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in impossible things had been completely vindicated. "Anna says that's how treasure works. The more you share it, the more valuable it becomes." As stars appeared above their ranch, now confirmed to contain everything they'd ever dreamed of finding, Sarah realized that Emma had been right about everything from the beginning. The treasure had been there all along, waiting for people brave enough to dig for it. And the most valuable discovery wasn't what lay buried in the earth, but what they'd built together above it. A family that chose each other, a community that supported second chances, and a legacy that would help other families find their own versions of impossible dreams made real. The girl who'd once talked to ghosts had become a young woman who understood that the past and future were connected by the choices people made when everything seemed lost. The desperate single mother had become a confident landowner who measured wealth by community impact as much as bank balances. And the bitter ex-husband had become a father who understood that the best gift he could give his daughter wasn't protection from uncertainty, but the tools to transform uncertainty into adventure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, mining operations to oversee, families to mentor through the Morrison Center, a ranch to manage, and a community to serve. But tonight, they were simply a family who'd bet everything on love and land and each other, and discovered that sometimes the most impractical dreams turn out to be the most practical choices you can make. Somewhere in the evening air above their ranch, Sarah could have sworn she heard the sound of Anna Morrison's approval, finally watching her beloved land fulfill its promise to give everything to those who loved it enough to give everything in return. And in the comfortable silence of three people who'd learned that home wasn't a place you found, but a place you built together, they sat watching stars appear over their piece of the American dream, knowing that the best adventures were still ahead of them. The Morrison Center's graduation ceremony took place on a crisp September morning, with 23 families celebrating their transition from emergency housing to sustainable rural independence. Sarah watched from the podium as children who'd arrived scared and uncertain now ran across the same pastures where Emma had once talked to ghosts in search for treasure. Emma, now 12 and tall for her age, served as the ceremony's student speaker. Her topic, why the best adventures start when everyone tells you to give up. 5 years ago, my mama and I were living in our car, Emma told the assembled families with the poise of someone who'd learned that vulnerability was a form of strength. We bought this ranch for $300 because it was all we had left. Everyone said we were crazy.
She gestured toward the thriving community that had grown around them. The sustainable housing units Jack Henley had designed, the organic gardens that fed both residents and the local food bank, the workshop spaces where people learned everything from renewable energy installation to traditional farming techniques.
But sometimes crazy is just another word for courage. And sometimes the treasure you're looking for isn't gold in the ground. It's the family you build when you refuse to give up on each other. Marcus, now a permanent resident who split his time between environmental law and ranch management, watched his daughter with the wonder of someone still amazed by how wrong his initial assumptions had been. The Morrison Center had grown into a model program studied by rural development specialists across the country, but its real success was measured in smaller victories. Children learning to trust again, parents discovering capabilities they'd never known they possessed, communities remembering how to take care of their own. As the ceremony concluded and families scattered across the ranch for the celebration dinner, Sarah found herself standing in the spot where they'd first discovered Anna Morrison's cache. The mining operation had concluded 2 years earlier, having extracted exactly the wealth the geological surveys had predicted, while leaving the land healthier than they'd found it. Emma appeared beside her, still carrying the confidence that came from learning early that impossible things became possible if you were willing to dig deep enough to find them. "Anna says thank you," Emma said simply, "for remembering that the real treasure was always the people." Sarah smiled, no longer questioning the source of her daughter's wisdom. After 5 years of watching dreams transform into reality through sheer determination and community support, she'd learned that some mysteries were more valuable than their explanations. Above them, the Montana sky stretched endless and blue, full of possibilities that still felt impossible until someone brave enough tried to make them real. Thank you so much for joining Sarah and Emma on their incredible journey from homelessness to hope. If this story inspired you, please like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories that prove miracles can happen when you refuse to give up on each other. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to people who need them most.